Today we're talking about the Opium War in global history. This is one of the sort of great conflicts of world history, one that is often seen to be the start of China's modern history, and certainly a time when relations between East and West seemed to move into a kind of definitively different kind of structure. Now, East and West are obviously kind of problematic categories, etc. But so are some of the other categories we often use to understand this war. For example, it's often called the Anglo-Chinese War. And what could be wrong with that? Or the first Anglo-Chinese War, because there were others. Well, one problem, obviously, as you can see here, is we're really not talking about China per se. We're talking about the Qing dynasty, this massive empire. And China, of course, is just one part of that empire, this sort of darker yellow part here. But so much more of the Qing is involved than just China. And the same thing with Anglo and England. It's not just England. This is the UK. And many of the soldiers fighting in the Opium War were not even from the British Isles. There were, and this would become even more true later in the 19th century, soldiers from other parts of what we call the British Empire. So the First Opium War. I think we're safe to call it the First Opium War. And it's an interesting war because it raises some very significant questions. The most important, or at least the one that I find is kind of most interesting, is that if we look at the Qing here, this is around 1820, it was, at that point, probably still very much the most powerful country in the world, the richest country in the world, certainly one of the most expansive in the world as a land empire. And it had been for a long period just unassailable, really, in East Asia, in Asia in general. That's around 1800, right? But now, 39 years later, England, or the UK, defeats it. And this sort of inaugurates a period of crisis, maybe crisis is too major of a word at the beginning of the Opium War, or 1842 when it ends. But following the Opium War, China is thrown into a time of troubles with other wars, both internal wars and external wars. So the question is, how did things shift so much? How do we get from a point where China is so powerful and maybe in many ways ahead of the world, and by China, again, I mean the Qing. See, I do it too. And how did this happen? And how did Great Britain defeat it so handily? Because it was a major defeat for such a great power. Well, in order to understand that, we have to look into the background. And the background has to do with trade and the Canton system. You can follow along on this sheet that you have available. And the Canton system, Canton is the name of this city down here, or it's one of the ways that we transliterate Guangzhou, this very important trade city in the south of China. Guangzhou, or Canton, as it was more pronounced in the Cantonese dialect, which the British took on, and many other Europeans, was the headquarters for European trade. This was the place that Europeans and other foreigners who came by ocean from the Western Ocean periods were allowed to trade. Now, there was also trade over land from above, but of the seaports, this was the main one. There was also a little bit of trade over here, but we won't worry about that. Most of it, and all of it with the Europeans, was focused on Canton. And here is an image where you can see the factories of the Europeans. They're called factories, but these buildings here, known as hang, are where the Europeans and other traders, including the Armenians and people from lots of different places, had this is where they had their headquarters. And they would trade here on the Canton River, or the Pearl River. And this is another image. And if you look at this image, it's interesting to see what you see. First of all, you notice that there are tons and tons of boats. This was a tremendously busy port. Europeans especially were especially when they first got there, when the Portuguese got there and the English got there early on, and the Dutch and the French, they wrote back about how amazing it was to see just these boats, and they would describe, for example, Amsterdam, one of the busiest ports in the world. The Dutch were just shocked that there was just so much more traffic here in Canton, and traffic of all kinds, little boats here. A lot of these are small, bigger ocean-going ships. But what you don't see here is large European ships. And this is one of the clues to what was starting to make the British, in particular, kind of upset. They felt that they were kind of pushed out of the mainstay of China's trade. They wanted more trade. And what did they want to trade? Well, this is the main thing they wanted. This is a much later image from 1888, but this would have been true or roughly accurate also for earlier periods. And what we're talking about now, by the way, is the late 18th century, as the British established themselves in Canton and became increasingly kind of dedicated to and hooked on Chinese tea. And of course the British loved their tea. Well, the best tea came from China, and all of that came to the British, or almost all of it came to the British through Canton. So they wanted tea. They also, to a certain extent, wanted porcelain. And this is just a lovely example of one of the porcelain sort of bowls that was just painted so delightfully by the artists in Canton. And this, again, is the British factory here. You see here, this one to the right is the Dutch factory. This is, I believe, Danish. I can't remember. This is probably Spanish. You can tell better when the flags are out. But let's go back to this picture and a detail of it. You can see the flags, but you also notice another thing, which is that the walls here are behind the factories. And again, this kind of gave the feeling, or is indicative of this feeling of the British and other Europeans of being kind of outside. They were held at arm's length. In fact, they weren't allowed to have direct contact with Chinese officials. I mean, they did at times, but they were supposed to interact with the Qing Empire by means of intermediaries, and those intermediaries were a group of merchants known as the Han merchants. So the British were increasingly frustrated by this. They had been taking over large parts of India and what's today India and other parts of the world. They were a rising power, and they felt that they wanted more trade. There was so much trade in China. They felt that they wanted China's to buy more British products. And so, because at this point, what they really had to offer really was silver more than anything else. Opium was not yet, and again, when I say this point, I'm talking around 1800, from when this image is from. They wanted to develop demand for British trade. And so they decided to send an embassy. And this is another image from the tops of the roofs. And here is an image of, this is really kind of where they had freedom to hang out on the area in front of their factories. These were called factories, but it's not because they made things in them. It was just the word for the places, the warehouses or lodges where they lived and where they did most of their business and kept a lot of their stuff. So in order to open up more trade with China and to open direct relations between the British court and the Chinese court, the British government decided to send an ambassador. And this is a sketch of him. His name is George Macartney, Lord George Macartney. And he's dressed here in his finest because he thinks that it will impress the Orientals, the Chinese. It didn't work. Here he is again. Here he is with his sort of second in command, Sir George Staunton. And they had a number of goals that they were trying to achieve. First of all, they wanted to open more ports to trade for Britain. So they wanted to go not just to Canton, but also to Fuzhou or Xiamen or somewhere like that, maybe all the way up to Tianjin in the north. They wanted to have a permanent ambassador stationed in Beijing. Now, this was not the way that things were done in China. Embassies to China were carried out on a sort of per embassy basis, where you would send your ambassador and they would bring gifts and there would be a ceremony and they would be given gifts for the sovereign and take them back. That was how it was always done. And other Europeans had fit into that so-called tribute system network. The Dutch had, the Portuguese had. But the British wanted to do it more in what they felt was a modern way. So they wanted a permanent ambassador in Beijing. They also wanted, and listen to this sounds just totally reasonable, they also wanted little bits of land on the Chinese coast where they could create their own little, colony maybe? They wouldn't call it that. But they wanted stations on the Chinese coast, on islands of the Chinese coast. And here their model was Portugal, which had a sort of toehold in Macau, which was considered to be in the territory of the Qing, in the territory of the Chinese. It wasn't actually a colony. At least that's not how the Chinese saw it. And so the British wanted something like this. Now, these were kind of big asks, if you think about it, especially since the Qing were quite aware that the British had been marauding in the seas and taking over parts of other countries. So they were quite aware of this. And so George Macartney had a pretty big task to fill. And it's safe to say that he did not fill it. He did not manage to do his task very well. This is interesting. This is fun. This is the son of this fellow here on the right. And he is the only European who really learned any Chinese to speak of. He was, I believe it was 12 years old when they set out, and he was taught Chinese on the way on the ship ride, and of course ship rides were quite long, so he had some time to do it, and he actually learned to write some Chinese and speak some Chinese by the time they got there. But he was the only one of the Europeans who really knew how to speak Chinese. McCartney himself didn't, Staunton didn't, and they didn't have any other Europeans who could do it. They did bring a couple of translators who were Chinese people who had lived in Naples and studied. They were Catholics and were coming back to China. They got a ride back to China in exchange for being part of the translation team, but one of them freaked out and decided he didn't want to deal with this whole thing. It was too much for him. Young George Thomas Staunton kept a diary, and this has never been fully transcribed. I had a student start transcribing it, but it's an amazing document. Basically a 12-year-old going on a huge mission to China, and he writes his stuff. For some reason, no one's ever published it, and I think it would be a great kind of thing to do. So any students who might want to do that, that might be fun. Anyway, so George Macartney arrives in the Chinese waters in 1793, sets out from England in 1792, arrives there in 1793, and usually what you would do is stop in Guangzhou or Canton, and then you would go by land up this way to Nanchang, and then along the Qiantang River to Hangzhou, up the Grand Canal, etc., going to Beijing, all sort of inland, usually by boat. But instead, he asked for and received permission to proceed by sea. And as he made his way up the coast, the Emperor of China, the Qianlong Emperor, became increasingly worried. He became worried because Macartney refused to participate in the standard protocols. And those protocols were the kowtow. So the kowtow has been considered to be one of the kind of key issues of this and many other diplomatic problems between China and the West, or the Qing and Western powers. The kowtow was a series of very deep bows where you touch your head all the way to the floor. You want to practice? Should we all practice this? Okay. Everyone stand up. I can't do it. I don't know if I'll still be on screen, but I'll try it. I'll do it. Here, I'm doing it. See? You stand up. When you approach the emperor, I have to get down here, I guess. The emperor is to the north, and you're approaching from the south. The emperor is like the pole star, unwavering. And when you see him, you are supposed to, from a standing position, get down on your knees. I'm gonna disappear for a second, and you put your head to the ground, tap your head to the ground 3 times, you stand, and then you do that twice more. So 9 head tappings or kowtows in all. Now, McCartney, and this gesture, by the way, was done by the emperor himself to his ancestors, and sometimes to heaven, and it was also done by kids to their parents in various forms of it. It was done by officials to the emperor. It was done to by officials to imperial documents, which were sort of draped in gold, or not gold, but imperial yellow silk. So if an edict arrived, for example, local officials would kowtow to it. In this way, the kind of power of the center and authority and charisma of the emperor in the center was replicated throughout this humongous, massive country, much bigger than any European country. So, but McCartney made clear that he was not going to do this. And as he made his way up the coast, and they brought various letters from the emperor and asked McCartney to please just do what you're supposed to do, he refused. And finally, as he was reaching Tianjin in his flagship, and then going ashore and getting closer to Beijing, it became clear that this was going to be a problem. And they tried to negotiate. So McCartney said, I will be happy to kowtow in the way that you do in your court if a minister of my equivalent rank, a Chinese minister of my equivalent rank, or Manchu minister of my equivalent rank, will bow to this. And he pulled out a portrait of King George III. Just kowtow to this portrait, and I will kowtow to your emperor. No problem, right? And they tried all sorts of things like this, but it didn't work. And ultimately, the emperor, even though he was frustrated, he wanted this all to go through, so he was flexible and said, fine, listen, McCartney can kowtow, can bow the way that he would naturally to his king. Okay, that's fine. And the way that naturally he would is, I'm going to skip this, except to note that, no, I'm skipping this. Here we go. This is the major meetings with the emperor actually happened not in Beijing itself, although some did later, but in Chengde, which is up here, and this is one of the places where the Manchus had a sort of summer palace, and the British were invited to the emperor's birthday in September of 1793, which took place there. And this is one of the places, it's just a beautiful palace system up in Manchuria. And the greeting took place outside. This is a sketch of it in 1793. And this is George Staunton describing what it was like. The emperor appeared from behind a high and perpendicular mountain skirted with trees, as if from a sacred grove, preceded by a number of persons busied in proclaiming aloud his virtues and power. He was seated in an open chair or triumphal car borne by 16 men and accompanied and followed by guards, officers of the household, high flag and umbrella bearers, and music. He was clad in plain dark silk with a velvet bonnet in form not much different from the bonnet of Scotch Highlanders. And this is just an image from a different, this isn't from the McCartney mission, but it gives you a sense of what that looked like. And there were many different palanquins and sedan chairs. Like, this was actually a pretty basic one. Some of them got much, much, much more elaborate. And this is a William Alexander sketch. He's one of the artists that accompanied the expedition. And by the way, McCartney brought so many people. He brought musicians and soldiers, and there was a whole brass band and artists and scientists and all that. So, and here they are. Supposedly this is what it looked like. This doesn't seem right to me. But this part is the important part, which is how McCartney greeted the sovereign, which is how the Europeans said he greeted the sovereign, which was to kneel on one knee and prefer the letter of King George III to the emperor. And so that's pretty much how it happened. So, right, that doesn't seem so bad. They managed to make a compromise and it works out. Well, the British were very hung up on the idea of the kowtow. They thought that the reason that their embassy ended up failing was because the Qing were just so upset about the kowtow issue that the British didn't show enough deference, and so they wanted them to show abject, submission, and that was the real issue where talks broke down. But what really frustrated the emperor more than anything and worried him and his officials was that the British seemed to be, not only did they not adhere to the protocols of the court, which is just something that you do when you're in a foreign country, you should accord by its protocols, they thought, but also that the British wanted a lot of things that just seemed kind of, I'm not going to say crazy, but beyond the pale. And the emperor, when he wrote to his officials, he called these sort of outrageous demands, like the idea of having a colony or having a permanent ambassador, but especially the colony idea. I mean, come on, what would I just think of, like, the Chinese, the chairman of the PRC coming and asking for just a little part of San Francisco or something like that. It's just a kind of an odd thing, especially for a country that is known for colonizing and taking small little toeholds and making them into massive exploitative colonies. So anyway, the emperor became more and more frustrated. Back in Beijing, they were supposed to look at the British presence, and the presents were like amazing things. I think I have. This is a funny sort of satirical thing that gives you just a sense of some of the presents, and we could talk about this image itself because it's delightful. But you can see some of the presents. A stagecoach. There was a beautiful coach that was. The British coaches were famous throughout Europe, with really nice springs and windows that would open and velvet and all this stuff. They gave one to the emperor. What else did they have? Oh yes, that's the one, the hot air balloon. They wanted to put up their hot air balloon. They had telescopes and models of ships and instruments and all kinds of things like that. And they wanted to show off, that this was the idea. They would give so much to show off how awesome Great Britain was and how technologically advanced they were. But what they found, first of all, was that a lot of the things that they were giving were things that the emperor already had. Like they had this amazing planetarium, they called it, which basically replicated the movements of all of the planets and everything like that, based on Newtonian physics, right? Newtonian mechanics, a whole new understanding of the way the heavens worked, right? And they were really proud of this. It was beautiful, state of the art. Well, they found, sort of to their surprise, that the Qianlong Emperor already had stuff like this that was just as good. Anyway, but that wasn't the real issue. The presents were cool enough, but it was the British threat. It was, these people were not to be trusted. And so back in Beijing, while Macartney wanted to start talking about let's start negotiating. He was thinking they would negotiate. And George Stoughton thought he would stay perhaps in Beijing as a permanent ambassador, but the emperor cut the visit short before the final farewell. There was supposed to be another kind of ritual, another banquet, and they sent them away and kind of tried to get them very quickly back through China. We can look at this a little bit more. I think one of the interesting things about this, if this were a live class, we'd talk about it, and you'd start to notice, well, first of all, these images of the Chinese don't really look like Chinese, right? Nor do they look necessarily like Manchus. It's sort of like very very caricatured, but there also is sort of a Turkish kind of feel. So the artist is kind of orientalizing the Chinese with making them look kind of like the sultans of Turkey or something like that. But it's interesting that the Chinese don't come off the worst here, I think, because this really is to criticize the British. If you look at the British, here they are just like bowing down, and the different people are kind of preferring their ridiculous little presents and this letter. This was to criticize Macartney more than anything else, and he was stung by the criticism, as were others. And so he and others became very upset. As they made their way back from China, they became increasingly upset at the treatment that they had received, especially because they were getting criticized at home. And so they interpreted Chinese or Qing dismissal as arrogance, as and they became very indignant. Now, that's not to say that there wasn't some arrogance there, but that arrogance was sort of reactive, I guess you could say. And the letters that McCartney ended up taking 2 letters back to King George III, and one of them you have available and have read for today, hopefully. We'll skip this poem. I mean, if you want to pause for a second and read it, it's quite interesting. But it's also, these same sentiments are also reflected in the letter. And the letter, well, let's actually look at these just quickly. Basically, the idea is that the emperor is not so interested in material things. So he isn't being given things, like these things are not what the whole point of interaction is about. Gifts are nice because they express sincerity. They're supposed to be gifts from the native soil. They can be humble things. But it's more about the interactions, right? It's more about welcoming guests from afar. He says here, I do not prize their curios and the exaggerated ingenuity of their devices. It would be better if they brought only a few trifles. I reward them generously, which is how I deeply and sincerely strive to preserve prosperity and peace. So the idea is that these embassies are designed not so much for negotiation, not so much to get things for your country, but to build a sense of community in the same way that rituals within a family or within the Qing itself were designed, at least in their ideal form, to build a structure of interaction. A child respects its parents. The parent takes care of its children. That is sort of ritual propriety, right? And they show them in various ways. At New Year's, the kids kowtow to their parents and to the ancestral tablets and all this stuff. That's part of keeping society structured and stable and keeping good relations. And so same thing in an international context. That's also supposed to be the case, where kings around the emperor come in and they give gifts, they kowtow, and all is one sort of family under heaven. That's the idea. But the British wanted to negotiate, and they wanted to impose a sort of Westphalian, what you could call Westphalian system of states interacting on a basis of supposed equality, sending ambassadors to each other to negotiate and make treaties and stuff. So that's kind of, people have said that there's a clash between different kinds of diplomatic cultures. But really, I don't think the clash is between diplomatic cultures so much, because the Qing understood that kind of interaction. They sometimes carried out that kind of interaction with the Russians and with others. What they also understood is that the British were not to be trusted, and so they wanted the British out of there. But the British didn't really interpret it that way. So, and there's an interesting counterpart. 2 years after McCartney, the Dutch went to Beijing, and whereas the McCartney mission failed miserably and he went back very frustrated, the Dutch mission, under a guy named Isaac Titsing, was extremely pleasant. Both sides left the encounter just pretty happy about the whole thing. The Dutch felt that they had achieved, they didn't have huge negotiating goals. They understood how East Asian diplomacy worked, that it was more about building relationships. But they felt that they had made a very good impression, and indeed they had. The Qianlong Emperor and others within the court were very happy with the Dutch by all accounts. So that's just kind of a counterpart. I'm actually writing a book about that. I could give a whole lecture about the Dutch one. It's really interesting, but you can read my book maybe at some point. So that's just to give a counterpart. And these are just a couple images of all the festivities. The Dutch were there during Chinese New Year, which is a really kind of festive time, and the emperor really wanted to show them a good time. He took them to the ice games, he took them to the Lantern Festival with fireworks and things like that, and it was, both sides had quite a bit of fun. Let's see where we are. I think this is a good place perhaps to stop, except that I want to say, at least for this part of the lecture, but I just want to say that the McCartney mission has been considered to be the beginning of a failure. it's a great failure, supposedly, because both sides failed to interact. The British and the Qing failed to develop a way to get along. And as Macartney and the British got increasingly frustrated when they went back, and especially after they were criticized and felt that they had been disdained, they began to develop a kind of narrative of Chinese arrogance and saying that the Chinese, the mission failed because the Chinese were just thought too highly of themselves. And so, and other historians have argued that, the Chinese historians have argued this as well, the Qing failed to interact with the West on this level. If they had accepted British demands and a permanent embassy, etc., then maybe they would have interacted better, and maybe the Opium War might have been avoided, or at least they would have known more about the West, etc. I think that both of these are kind of arguments that don't really make sense. At the time, to my mind, this was the only real choice that could be made. Could you really grant the British all the things that they wanted, or even some of the major things that they wanted, trade in other ports, a permanent ambassador, and colonies on your soil? No, you couldn't really. If you did any of those things, then all the other Europeans would start asking for them too. So anyway, there's sort of lots of different ways you can argue about this. But the point is, at the end of the Macartney mission, the British were not satisfied. Their basic dissatisfaction persisted. And that's why the Macartney mission is often seen as a prelude to the Opium War.